So good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second panel. I think it's good morning, good afternoon. We're at that kind of transitional phase. So the question we've set ourselves is, how can greater equity and inclusion be achieved through integration? I'm Jane Vertkin, Policy and Practice Advisor at the National Centre for Family Hubs, and we'll be offering a series of reflections on work that has achieved greater equity and inclusion, and doing this through a series of short presentations. This will be followed by questions and answers, as with the last panel. I'm just going to ask the panel to introduce themselves, starting with Rob.
Hello, nice to meet you. I'm Rob Pears. I'm a public health consultant and a civil servant, not the civil service. That's a bit ambitious. But I'm the government representative on this panel, and I work in the Office of Health Improvement and Disparities, a catchy title, but disparities means inequalities in government speak, and it's part of the Department of Health and Social Care.
Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Baker. I'm Professor of Religion, Belief and Public Life, based at Goldsmiths, University of London, and it's lovely to be here. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Danielle Oom. I am the Chair of the Integrated Care System in Coventry and Warwickshire. Really pleased to be here.
Afternoon, I'm Anthony Harper. I'm the Head of Integrated Children's Commissioning in Portsmouth. I'm responsible for ICB, NHS Commissioning, the Local Authorities Public Health Commissioning, and the Local Authorities Children's Service Commissioning.
And I'm Catherine Drake-Wilkes. I'm a Family Hub Manager here in Westminster. This is the south locality of Westminster where my hub is, so I'd like to welcome you all to our locality.
Okay, so family hubs offer us all the opportunity to try something new, to find new solutions to issues of inequality that are faced by many of the children and families that we work with. The starting point for many of us here, in your areas I suspect, is that there are huge variations in outcomes for children in terms of health and education, and for these children's parents too. Continuing to do what we've always done isn't an option if we want to create new opportunities for these children. We know that gaps in achievement at age 16 related to socioeconomic status continue and represent one of the greatest challenges to equity and social mobility agendas. The disproportionate health and economic impact that COVID-19 had on vulnerable groups acted as a stark reminder of how profoundly discrimination and related inequities such as poverty, limited access to services, and discrimination in the jobs market remain a root cause of poor health and other outcomes. The COVID-19 pandemic also shone a light on the barriers embedded in our structures and institutions, which require active change, highlighted by many reports long before the pandemic. And interestingly, just before the pandemic, in October 2019, UCL, together with the Resolution Foundation, published a report entitled Structurally Unsound, Exploring Inequalities, Igniting Research to Better Inform UK Policy. In many cases, I'm sure you'll agree with me, single structures and institutions are not well placed to address the multi-layered nature of inequalities, but providing and finding an integrated response across a place, as family hubs provide, offer the chance of a new approach. And that place-based approach is something that was stressed in the UCL report. In Westminster, where I've worked as well, we set up integrated leadership teams around all of our family hubs. And this was really enabled with a COVID pandemic, a really swift response to need. And Catherine will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So while COVID shone a spotlight on inequality, it was also a time of new solutions and new relationships, and in some cases a start of greater participation and integration. And we'll hear in our panel reflections about some of the new work with communities from Chris, Danielle and Anthony. So in developing our family hubs, the challenge is clear in relation to inequalities. We know things won't change if we do nothing different. We need, through our integrated place-based family hub approach, to start something new in our areas. But in developing our family hubs, will we be content to set up a range of activities and services, and that will be it? That'll be our family hub. Or will we create something more dynamic, where we're continually using data, and I think that's what Josh was saying this morning, to understand need and access, where we're having a new dialogue with the community. And this community is at the heart of designing services. And will we train our staff, our integrated workforce, to collectively show compassion, humility, and curiosity, and deepen their knowledge and understanding of cultural diversity and social justice? Will this become the new norm, as I'm using Chris's words that he's going to use in his talk? We have this opportunity now, and we can even strengthen what we do in our family hubs by joining up with other transformation programs, the integrated care systems, the SEND transformation, just to give two examples. And there'll be different initiatives in different areas. Everyone's context is different. So I was reminded recently of the harsh reality of inequalities by attending a webinar organised by Rob on infant and child mortality. I went along thinking it would be interesting. Ashamed to say I didn't immediately make the connection with family hubs. But seeing the different life chances that infants and children have in this country in terms of actual mortality was stark and humbling. I realised that, of course, this is in every way relevant to family hubs, as family hubs aim to address all the factors which can prevent many of these deaths. I've asked Rob to start our panel by sharing this data. We'll then move on to focus on some of the learning and from the COVID-19 pandemic and some of the integrated responses within communities.
Thank you, Jane. So I'm just going to share 4 slides showing a bit of data. And this is what Josh was talking about, having the evidence base to do things right and to know what to do. Of course, you can have all the figures in the world, you can have all the evidence in the world, but then it's how you interpret it and make it happen, which is a real challenge, which is why it's so important to have interventions in a place-based way. And this links up very much with the statistic that Claudia started us with at the start, that actually there are very different outcomes in maternal health, and that feeds through to babies, children and young people as well. I need to thank Professor Karen Leut for this. She's the director of the National Child Mortality Database, and they do some fantastic work across the country to better understand where children are dying, where babies are dying, and from that to try to see the patterns and what we can do to intervene and reduce that number of deaths in the future. So here we're comparing mortality rates in children across different countries in the world. And the point that we're making here is that in England, the disparities are massive between those that are most wealthy and those families that are least well off. And if you look at the most deprived quintile, we're around Serbia, Russia, the Slovak Republic, but then at the other end, if you look at the least deprived quintile, it's more like Luxembourg and Sweden and Finland. And this is all happening within a relatively small geographical space. One of the great things about family hubs is that it's an opportunity to intervene across really complex processes in a very systematic way. And there are lots of things that we can do to reduce the mortality of children and young people. And here's just some of the examples. The skew here is from a sort of public health point of view, a health perspective. And I think one of the really exciting things about family hubs is that health and healthcare can support children's services to give that all-around wraparound support to our vulnerable families and communities.
But a few examples here: maternal obesity and smoking, unsafe sleep. Lots of people still don't know how best to support their newly born babies, and there's challenges around housing and co-sleeping. And then some of the wider determinant stuff. So it's not just the stuff that the NHS can deal with, but thinking about domestic abuse and thinking about the quality of housing. There's been lots of emphasis around the pressure on rental markets at the moment, and Malden families leading to tragic results, Malden houses leading to tragic results. So I just wanted to say a bit about the situation in London. That's where I work. And these couple of slides were put together by my colleague, Nayab Nasir, who's in my team. And the point that this is looking at infant mortality rates, and the point here is that even in the 10th most deprived neighbourhoods in London, you're twice as likely, pretty much, to die in infancy as the least deprived. And it's a really pretty straightforward downward line. The more wealthy you are, the less chance you are of you risk of dying in infancy, so the first year of life. And it's also a very similar picture for children, so 1 year old to 18 years old. Again, it's about you're twice as likely to die in the most deprived neighbourhoods as the least deprived neighbourhoods. And we're using this data to develop a strategy to reduce infant and child mortality. We're presenting to the London Health Board, which is the Mayor's Health Board, in July, with ideas around what we can do to reduce mortality in London. And integration of services will be absolutely critical to that. The ability to share best practice, the ability to work across organisational boundaries. And family hubs is a very exciting part of that journey. Thank you.
I'm going to sit down if that's all right, because that podium's about a third of my height, and I'm not sure my very focal lenses will cope with it. So a very simple kind of proposition I want to put to you today is that for all the horror and the awfulness of the pandemic, it did actually open up new spaces to have new conversations and new ideas about how we can innovate to meet the immediate challenges of the pandemic. But I think from what I'm hearing today, and I'm not an expert in this field, some of the lessons I want to try and reinforce the idea that some of the lessons that we learned through these new spaces, these new conversations, these new innovative structures that had to emerge because the challenges of the pandemic were so beyond the scale of our normal ways of doing things, what I would call the old normal. We had to develop a new normal. And I'm just going to share with you a bit of the research I've done on what this new normal looked like in a particular case study, which was, I was commissioned by the APPG on Faith and Society to do some work looking at how faith groups responded in partnership with their local authorities to meet the challenges and demands of the pandemic. So there were two reports that I produced through my unit there, the Faith and Civil Society unit at Goldsmiths. The first is called Keeping the Faith, Partnerships Between Faith Groups and Local Authorities During and Beyond the Pandemic. That came out in 2020 and covered the experience of the first lockdown. And then a second report in 2022 called Keeping the Faith 2, Embedding a New Normal in partnerships between faith groups and local authorities. So it's embedding the new normal that I want to share with you just for a few minutes. When we undertook the research, we approached all local authorities across the UK, 408, in case you're interested. And we got an amazing response because this was the summer of 2020. People were, literally rushing around trying to improvise solutions to what was going on. And we got a return rate of 48%, so 194 local authorities responded to our survey. And the headline that really comes out of that first report is, due to the professionalism, the flexibility, and the indispensability of the contribution of faith groups to what local authorities were able to respond to in the pandemic, 67% of local authorities reported an increase in partnership working with their faith communities. 91% said that that experience was positive or mostly positive, and 76% said that they intended to continue the partnership working developed with their faith communities during the pandemic into the future. So a whole raft of other data in that first report suggested that we were coming across a kind of new space to talk about the relationships between faith and secular agencies in responding to deep existential social crises. And the experience of shared by both faith and secular partners was that the pandemic allowed the evolution of deepening relationships, a willingness to share resources and innovation, and a commitment to a more inclusive framework for partnership working that moved from delivery and dissemination to much more strategic forms of intentional co-creation. And the other interesting factor in that first report was that the kind of traditional fears that I think many secular groups have when they work with faith groups around, the possibility of proselytization or apparently socially conservative norms or safeguarding issues were suspended, put to one side. So traditional suspicions and stereotypes were put to one side. I think that's one key lesson from the pandemic that we can all reflect on, because people wanted to respond communally as one community to the issues that was being raised. The second report I referred to wanted to put more flesh on this idea of this new normal space based on trust. We've heard the word already, relationship. What did this look like? How can we begin to maybe understand what this new normal looks like? And we juxtaposed what came out of the conversations. The second report was people juxtaposing the old way they used to work before the pandemic and the new way that they were working during the pandemic. And one particular area of policy where this old versus new normal was really apparent was around the area of finance. How are things financed? How are valuable resources shared? And under the old mindset, the old normal, the traditional procurement model of finance reinforced static and an embedded sense of hierarchy between experts and supplicants. So that's a hallmark of the old normal, if you like, the old normal way of doing things, of working in partnership. Old normal thinking tends to favor instrumental and technical language that doesn't connect with faith communities. Maybe it doesn't connect with anyone. Partnership working tends to default to existing large providers who can work at scale and already have existing contracts. But then this just simply introduces a sense of suspicion about transparency and process. Local authorities' budgets were substantially cut anyway, so there was very little money to dispense anyway. So this myth of always having to go for money kind of was driving the process, driving the partnership. And so it was perceived to be a deficit rather than growth-framed way of looking at how to challenge, to meet increasing challenging problems. The new mindset that people discovered during their partnership in resolving the issues around the pandemic was, well, we start with the problems, not budgets. And again, I think I heard that in the previous panel. And then we come up with possible solutions and action plans. One faith-based leader said, funding is the last thing I ever talk about. Rather, we prefer to start with a series of open questions. What is God calling us to do? What is the city calling us to do? And how are we responding to God's call? So this aligns problem solving and asset allocation with personal and institutional core values, minimizing the danger of burnout and resentment. And local authorities found themselves asking the same questions, but obviously without the God language. What is the city calling us to do? What is our community calling us to do? And the amazing thing was, in the research that we did, that these conversations were happening both in parallel, but also in joined up spaces together. So both faith and secular actors were asking these questions in each other's presence and each other's company. So starting from the position of call rather than resources, in the experience of our respondents, released new energies and thinking that was indispensable to the needs of the moment. So in the conclusion to our second report, we hypothesize, or we suggest, that COVID-19 led to more authentic, participatory and dynamic forms of governance and decision-making, and a willingness to experiment with a more values-led economy. In a values-led economy, outcomes were framed by these shared words across both faith and secular partners to describe what a good partnership between local authorities and faith groups feels like and where it begins. Words like kindness, empathy, compassion, motivation, hope, friendship, and social justice. I can't remember the last time I read a policy document that began with words like that. That's not quite true, but you know what I mean. And I think the key message that came out of this research was that the discovery of these shared values, because the pandemic encouraged us to think, well, what unites us rather than what separates us, was that shared values, and again, this came up in the first panel, so you're beautifully setting up my argument for me. Shared values are far more likely to lead to shared outcomes because there is that sense of enhanced trust, communication, innovation, participation, and shared responsibility. So just to finish my report, there were two other elements that came out of my research that were supported, that needed to be there to support this new idea around shared values leading to shared outcomes. And the first was the realization that we need to move from the language of co-production to the language of co-creation. There's huge amounts of literature around this, but essentially co-creation is a much more active, engaged kind of form of partnership. Co-production is traditionally a bureaucratic and technical process whereby stakeholders or consumers are involved in the delivery of a service. Someone's already established the parameters of that service. Co-creation demarcates a more radically open space where citizens are not merely co-implementers of a service, but they are co-initiators and co-designers. And my final slide, I think, responds to this idea of leadership. A certain type of leadership model emerged that facilitated this kind of sharing of values across difference and this idea of co-creation and not co-production. And I'm using a theological word here, I hope that's all right, from the New Testament, from the Greek word kenosis, which means an emptying. Kenotic leadership is a leadership that empties itself, that divests itself. And Elaine, you put it beautifully when you said the importance of losing grip, losing control. Maybe not emptying yourself, but stepping aside from your institutional norms, taking the risk of thinking beyond your knowledge and your expertise and your way of doing things. Because when you step aside from your own institutional perspective, you allow other perspectives to emerge, other wisdoms, other traditions. And this inevitably involves an element of risk-taking and openness, which is why we don't like doing it, and the possibility we might fail. But it also models relationality, authenticity, and partnership, I think, genuine partnership, and creates hospitable and safe spaces for the practical sharing and application of beliefs, values, and worldviews to very technical issues. Thank you very much.
So, integrated care systems are working on a very ambitious agenda. So if we get it right, we totally subvert the model of health and social care. So we move away from an ill health service to something that is much more about empowering people to take ownership of their own lives, to flourish, to thrive, and that when they need services, those services are the right services that respond to their needs, that are accessible, and irrespective of your background, you'll be able to achieve equitable outcomes. So that's what we're here to achieve. But obviously, that is a big ask. We're all operating in very challenging circumstances, and we really need to make sure that we push very hard to hold on to that idea. And the family hubs is really a key part of that. It's a real example, a real model for working in this integrated way that supports people to be more than just the recipient of services. The NHS, I think, has been mentioned previously. It's not an island. It needs to work in partnership. It doesn't always find that easy. And so having things that work, having models that work, having agencies and organisations who are already comfortable with that language and that approach is really important on this agenda. So what I wanted to do was just very briefly give a bit of a flavour of how Coventry and Warwickshire integrated care system is seeking to address the ambitious transformational agenda that I highlighted, and how I feel that the family hubs is a really important part of that, and how I would like it to be an even more important part of it going forward. And I'll give some examples of the sorts of work that we're doing as well. So that just gives you a sense in this slide of the range of inequalities or disparities that we are facing in Coventry and Warwickshire. So they're two very different areas. So Coventry is predominantly urban, very young population, high levels of deprivation, and with pockets of affluence. Warwickshire is a lot of rural areas, not totally, less ethnically diverse, and elderly population predominantly. So there's quite different challenges across the integrated care system, and I've set out some of the specific differences that we're facing. But some specifics that I also wanted to add was that Coventry and Warwickshire is facing a significantly increasing demand for learning and disability and autism assessments, and also increased demand for CAMS services, which is really quite significant. So as you can see, just from the information that I've set out here, what we're talking about in terms of the family hubs and what the family hubs are doing, there's clearly a place for it. So this is the King's Fund model for a population health management approach, and that is the model that we've adopted in Coventry and Warwickshire. And it's really vital that we do focus on that bottom left-hand quadrant, which is about integrating the health and care system. And that is where predominantly the most of the NHS resources are spent, overseen by the Integrated Care Board. But that's not enough. Just that bottom corner is not enough to move to a population that is taking ownership of their lives and feeling able to access services when they need them, and that those are the right services. We really need to work in a way that is supporting people to feel in control in all aspects of their lives. And so that means bringing together things such as transport, access to employment, education, housing. So it's far more than simply providing good quality health services, which I know that you all know, but I just think it's really important to be very explicit about the ambition for this agenda. the kenosis that Chris was referring to, I think is a really powerful concept. The idea that we stand outside of our organisational perspectives and really try to consider what is it that collectively we need to achieve and what's the best way of doing that. That requires a real shift in mindset. It's something that we're working on in Coventry and Warwickshire. I wouldn't say that we're completely there yet, but we're really very explicitly working on developing that together and building upon the learning from the pandemic. One particularly really strong example in Coventry and Warwickshire was their response to the vaccination drive, which you'll recall we'd seen real levels of inequality in terms of which communities were bearing the brunt from the pandemic, and targeting of the vaccination seemed like a very sensible idea. However, there was really high levels of distrust, and people for all sorts of reasons had felt unwilling or uncomfortable with engaging with statutory services. So this working together with faith communities, with community centres, completely outside of the comfort zone of many in the NHS or in statutory services, it was a completely different way of working. And we're trying to capture that essence and continue that as far as possible. And I think it's really important to note that when you look at this model, the family hub model actually works across all four of those quadrants, so it's clearly a very important model. So just to sort of give you some sort of specific information about the Coventry and Warwickshire approach. Coventry was selected as one of the original 75 local authorities on the National Hub programme. And it's recently been confirmed as one of the 14 trailblazers. So it's really going to be expanding the family hub model. It's going to be using a hub and spoke approach so that it can make sure that people who are a long way from the existing centres have got access through other community organisations, through a virtual offer. And also it will be very rigorously applying all of the criteria of the family hub model, so that it's then in a position to extract the learning and share that across other local authorities. So very, very much bought in. We've got 8 family hubs in Coventry operating across the city. They focus on 0 to 19 and up to 24 for those with special educational needs. In Warwickshire, we're not part of the Family Hub programme, but we are developing children and family centres. So within those, the partnership working enables children to have the best start in life. It's a whole family approach. It's very much influenced by the Family Hub model. And that focus on the 1001 critical days for children. Health visiting and midwifery are also co-located in the majority of the services, and there's speech and therapy language services and drop-in sessions. There's very strong links to the voluntary and community centre in both Coventry and Warwickshire. I suppose in conclusion, I'd just like to say that in Coventry and Warwickshire we are working to try and embed family hub working across the whole, but obviously there's slight differences and nuances in terms of how we're applying that in the two places. This co-location of services, the multi-agency working, and the encouraging and empowering practitioners and clinicians to step outside of their organisational boundaries and make decisions based on the people in front of them is something that we're really trying to embed as a core way of working in Coventry and Warwickshire. I do think that we can go further. I thought that before, but since prepping for this conference and really getting to grips with the model, the Family Hub model, I can really see the potential, and I would like to encourage resources wrapping around the Family Hub to expand upon that. And I think being very much more explicit that this is about tackling inequality, which is one of the explicit aims of the integrated care system, is something that we can go further on to. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Anthony from Portsmouth, and I'm hoping to give you a bit of a sense of what some of this stuff looks like in practical terms. So to give you a bit of background during COVID, what we were able to see and realise, as I'm sure many areas were, was that really dynamic system change where we kind of released a lot of the rules that restricted what we were doing, and it allowed us to develop very quickly some service structures that we hadn't been able to realise before. We set up a central children's hub which used redeployed colleagues from various parts of the system, which gave them access to all of our community services and gave them links across the system they hadn't previously had. It meant that we were able to deliver home visits and checks on vulnerable pupils that weren't being seen in schools. We were able to deliver medication and food parcels and all of those other things that were being done. But what we were able to do is to seat that right in the middle of our community infrastructure and to deliver it through that. We were able to speed up the process of our online delivery and to start seeing how families engage with our usual services in a virtual sense. We were able to respond to VCS, so our voluntary and community sector contracts and specification changes much quicker. We didn't have to go through loads of committees, we didn't have to go through lots of boards. We were able to respond to needs that families were telling us on the ground in relatively short spaces of time. What we were able to do is to deliver those vulnerable pupil checks with services that were being redeployed because they couldn't run their stay and plays. We were able to vary the way in which our send short breaks offer was delivering, so that we were able to offer some bespoke one-to-one sessions and some much smaller group sessions across the city rather than the larger sessions that we were delivering. We were able to use our money much more flexibly because the standard rules that we had in place had gone. And what we were really able to do is to do that co-production at a much deeper level with our families and with our schools in particular, to understand how we could change the normal model that we had to meet the demands of those families in the face of the pandemic. What we were also fortunate at the end of the pandemic to receive is a large amount of funding from DfE and Department of Health to really develop our family hub as one of the 75 investment areas. So what that's allowed us to do is to really focus on what we've learned from the pandemic, to look at our last best place for many of our services. So we've heard Sure Start being mentioned. As in most local authority areas, a lot of our Sure Start structure has kind of gone and slowly been dismantled. What we were able to do is to look at the evidence base that we had from those services that were working well, and to combine that with the new things that we'd learned and the pace in which we'd seen things working during COVID. What that's allowed us to do is to deepen our decision making and our integration. So over the last 2.5 years, my team has kind of grown and developed and really brings our NHS health decision-making and our local authority decision-making together. So we've got an integrated system now of commissioning, which allows us to be much more flexible with our money. We still have a health pot and a local authority pot, and I'm sure one day we'll get around to merging the two of them. But until we do, we're able to flex how we're spending money across those two things. We're able to make sure that we're putting the best things in the right places, and we're much less worried about the organisational boundaries that would usually sit with that. What it's also allowed us to do is to engage in places that we wouldn't ordinarily have engaged. So the local authority suddenly has a whole host of information about our health inequalities that it wouldn't necessarily have previously seen. And the NHS is being able to see a lot of local authority information, particularly around some of our vulnerable pupils, our looked after children, our care experience community, in a way that they wouldn't have seen them previously. Our education link coordinators were part of the COVID hub and have now been mainstreamed into the work that we do. They contact all of our schools on a fortnightly basis, and they have a conversation with them about their most vulnerable pupils, particularly thinking about those with chronic non-attendance, where schools are increasingly struggling to reach out into those families, those homes, those communities. But the work that was done during the pandemic really underpinned the value of having that one-to-one one link for schools. Our Family Hub plans have been accelerated, and we've seen lots of developments in terms of what we're doing. Our co-production was already very good in the city, particularly around SEND. What we hadn't done is taken those lessons into other areas of our work. So what we've been able to do is to really begin to understand the importance of using parents as experts, the importance of taking challenge from those parents around what we're doing and how we're doing it, and the importance of being really open to those differences where previously we would have been quite closed because a particular process required us to be, or because we knew best because I've done it for 20 years. All of those things, we've started to be much braver in terms of what we're doing, and co-production is really becoming a mindset in terms of what we're delivering, rather than being that very kind of structured process that we just check in with families. We've been able to integrate the voluntary and community sector into our Family Hub offer in a way that we haven't seen before. We've always engaged with them, and we've always had that co-delivery in terms of them delivering services out of our Family Hub sites. What we've done as part of the Family Hub investment programme is to allocate significant amounts of funding from that investment into our voluntary sector. We've sought to have one voluntary sector organisation that can provide a wide range of services at real grassroots level, really feeding off what families are telling us about preferring peer support to statutory officers bobbing around in the family hubs, really wanting to be able to access things at a time they want rather than when we've programmed it in. So our voluntary sector will now deliver some of our core elements around our parenting programmes, around our education catch-up programmes, and importantly, they'll also provide our family hub champions, the person who will be in each of our family hubs as the person coordinating what's going on, but also that relational practice development. So there's one consistent person that families can contact, that can signpost them through. And that importance of the voluntary sector really gives us some development opportunities that we've not had before. Voluntary community sector is so much more agile than the local authorities and NHS structures, and it means that we're able to move much quicker and respond to changing data and changing needs of our populations. What isn't catching up is the way in which public sector is required to procure those things. So being open, being creative, and using our procurement systems continues to be a real challenge, but it is absolutely possible with that tenacity of leadership to do things in a very different way. Our parent panel is developing. What we're not doing is creating another panel and asking another load of parents to volunteer their time, but actually looking at all of the really important structures we already have in place. Our Maternity Voices partnership that have been doing some significant work on health inequalities in maternity. Our parent carer structure that's been doing lots of really important work around our SEND and inclusion. So rather than looking for another new panel, really drawing on the skills that we already have in the system. And what we've also been able to do is look at our workforce in a very different way and to really begin to look at it as a system, having the same expectations of workforce training, development and delivery on our statutory services as well as on our voluntary sector service. Our volunteers delivering stay and plays will have the same level of evidence-based training as our frontline practitioners that we're employing through our system. What we've also done is to link with Southampton and the Isle of Wight, who are very local to us and also have the funding, to really look at a system of workforce development across the three areas, to really consider what that skills mix looks like, to really consider pathway development for the workforce so that we can keep people in the system, whether they're working physically in our city or further across, and for people to really see a pathway of service delivery for families rather than seeing individual services developing. I think that's me.
Manager actually in this area to talk a little bit about the integrated leadership team around her family hub and the difference that's made to being able to respond to emerging need. And I'd just like to thank Catherine particularly because she joined the panel at the 11th hour, so thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, in Westminster, inequality can feel particularly stark. Where we're sitting here today, we're literally in the shadow of Westminster Abbey, where our king will be crowned in a couple of weeks' time. We're within a stone's throw of Parliament. That's not a recommendation, by the way. But the streets where we're sitting now were in the 19th century known as the Devil's Acre. Dickens called it the most deplorable manifestation of human wretchedness and depravity. The word slum was first used of these three streets. Now that slum was cleared. A philanthropic estate was built, which is still here, the Abbey Orchard Estate. But if you look at the stats, they are the multiple deprivation index, they are 10.1, so 0.1% away from the 10% most deprived in the country. So what's really changed? So where we are in our family hub, we have our integrated leadership team, as Jane mentioned. And myself and the other two family hub leads in Westminster were interviewing yesterday for some family navigators. And you ask people, are there any questions that you have about the role? And a couple of people said, who's in the team? How many people are in the team? And it made us take a step back and think, well, what do you mean by team? Because we were trying to explain there are other family navigators, but there are the people who work with you in the family hub as part of the multi-agency team. But more and more, it is the whole early help system. It's all the people who work in all of everyone working with children and families in the locality. And as a family hub leader, over time, those other managers in that leadership team are the people I think of as my team when I need to get things done. So we are doing some really important long-term work in terms of integration of health visiting and children's centre staff, for example. We're working with our ICB around the 20% most deprived. They are going to share with us the information of those children so that we can find out who we already know, do proactive outreach to those we don't, because we know they're at risk of poorer health outcomes. But if we know that children and families just around the corner are struggling to meet their family's basic needs, we can't wait for those information sharing agreements and transformation pieces of work. We need to react. So if you are living around here, people think you live somewhere really posh. And also, there's no discount shops, there's no pound shops, there's no Aldi and Lidl. So some of the conversations that we have as practitioners and leaders in the area about what we know about the needs means that we can do something practical. So if you got here early like I did today, you would have seen the van from City Harvest arrive. So as a result of those discussions about shopping, there is now a community pantry here in the Abbey Community Centre where you can come and have the dignity of paying a few pounds, but then get a whole week's worth of shopping for that few pounds. We are thinking about those families who are struggling to buy school uniform. We know what a huge cost that is, particularly secondary uniform. We know how much it impacts on you if you go to school and you haven't got the same gear as your mates. What that does in terms of your mental health, how you may be more likely to avoid school. So we have, when we want to get things done, people I call on are the manager of the local youth club 2 streets away, the manager of the Cardinal Hume Centre, lots of experience around family services and homelessness, the manager of the St Vincent Family Project, our school nursing team lead. So together, those brilliant people put together what we're going to call, we started off calling it a uniform bank, but we don't like the name. So we were inspired by some of our faith-based partners at the Salvation Army who've set up a community wardrobe and have it like a shop where you can come in and try things on. And we have people in the local community organise donations from surplus for shoes, and brilliant northern woman has got a project called Get Your Big Coat On for some warm coats. So it's those really practical things that we have been able to use that COVID spirit of actually we just need to meet some needs. We've had an even starker piece of inequality, like many authorities have, where we've had asylum seekers in the contingency hotels locally. So if you travelled in via Victoria Station, very close to that, there would have been some hotels which look quite nice on the outside, but it's pretty grim if you're living there for 18 months and you've only got a room and you can't cook your own food and your toddler's not eating the food. You feel so powerless as a parent, and we've had real concerns about children failing to thrive. And also for the older young people about contextual safeguarding risks when they're in those hotels. So we have been able to use those partnerships to work in an integrated way, to arrange events where families and young people could come to youth clubs. Because if you don't know what a youth club is, how would you know to go there and that it's a thing you can go to and it's free? So to introduce them to that, to have it, provision at the Cardinal Hume Centre where people can go, have ingredients that are culturally appropriate bought for them so they can cook, feel a sense of control, efficacy to be able to provide for their family. And here at the Abbey Centre there is a community meal on a Friday after school where families will get together, cook together and share that meal with the children when they come home from school. So it's not enough, it doesn't address everything, but we feel as though we're using that integration in a really positive way to make a difference for children and families in Westminster.
Shall we take a couple of questions? If anyone's got any questions for the panel or that you'd like to ask. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jane. I'm from Coventry. I'm responsible for the Family Hub programme. Many of the speakers have talked about what was good in COVID or what we learned, but many of us will recognise that going back, building back better hasn't quite worked. So many of us now face some of the systematic challenges around things like procurement, rules, etc., that we were all able to change the rules. So things that people suggest to me are absolute became not absolute. We were able to make up new rules. So a question to the panel or to members of the panel is, what advice have you got or suggestions on how we remake those new rules and how we might overcome the pervasive element of kind of those old systems in order to really be able to do the sort of work that our colleague has just been describing? Thanks.
Who wants to?
Just a very quick response. I mean, I think what's why I stress leadership at the end. So I think a lot of this relies on institutions reflecting on the culture that they used to have, and which, as you say, was dismantled very effectively. So yes, I'm worried that the old norms come back. They do. The old normal comes back. People forget. But as you rightly said, we must never forget the trauma, the pain, the suffering that people went through, and we must always, 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 make sure that, when the next pandemic comes. So to be looking forward, I think it's about couching what can we learn from this pandemic to make us more resilient when the next one comes. And I'm at least hoping in policy terms that, because we've been, we were so complacent when this pandemic hit us. We know we can never be complacent again. And I think there's huge lessons that we learned, what everyone's been saying in the panel so far, that need to be fed into a strategic agenda about future resilience. And maybe that's the policy framework that drives forward the political and institutional need to keep the new normal at the forefront. Thank you.
I think there's also something that's really important about getting commissioners and providers always in the same room together, because there's always people who are providing the service at any one time. And I think we used to be scared almost of getting those providers in the room if there was a new contract coming up for renewal. But those providers have a lot of knowledge about the community. So I think we need, in the spirit of partnership, to get those two parties together whilst we still negotiate new contracts, if that makes sense. And that's something certainly that happened in Westminster. It's not always an easy path to tread, but I think it's really important that we come together and continue that even around kind of contract renewals. Yeah.
So when I was talking about Coventry and Warwickshire, I mentioned the fact that we're not completely there yet. It's something that we're working on. So the approach that we're taking is to build on the lessons learned from the past. So the two health and wellbeing boards and the clinical commissioning group, as it was then, had developed a concordat for how they would behave with each other. And so we've built on that and made it just more explicitly relevant to the ICS agenda. But it's not really changing a lot of those principles. Most of those principles were very sound. So it's about creating that sort of touchstone that you can hold up as a challenge when things are being done in a different way. This is not the spirit of what we agreed. I think one of the earlier speakers said that's not the Brighton Rock way, you know. So it's that sort of being able to challenge. So it's got to be top down and bottom up, hasn't it? So there's a recognition that this is the way that we want to work. This is the way that we've said that we're going to approach it, and then it has to feed through to all your systems and processes, so everybody understands that that's the way and feels empowered to be able to challenge it. So it is going to be a long, hard slog, but we just have to keep hold of it and not let go of it.
May I quickly come back on the procurement question? We're stuck with procurement rules. Sometimes you'll have a legal team in your council that can think of some innovative solutions to a particular problem. But how we implement those rules and how we work can be different. And when we think about the way services were provided during the pandemic, there often had to be a lot of flexibility around face-to-face contacts, what people can do, what's realistic with the workforce that was available. And I hope that some of that sort of flexibility and that change in the leadership style can transition into a new period of time. So it's about compassionate leadership, it's about giving staff autonomy, a sense of belonging, making people feel competent, thinking about the types of people that we have in the workforce. So workforce development becomes critical. One of the really exciting things about the pandemic was that people came into our professions and supported our work that hadn't necessarily thought about a statutory sector or a voluntary sector post before, and they brought new energy and new perspectives and more trust from our local communities. And I hope that we can maintain some of that and indeed build on it, so that, for instance, in London, we want our workforce to better reflect the diversity of our community across all those different protected characteristics. And we were talking about care leavers this morning. So I think there's a lot of stuff that we can do to change the culture, even if we're stuck with the rules.
We've probably got time for one more question.
My name is Jamie Walker. I'm the transformation lead in Bury Council in Greater Manchester. We are one of the authorities that weren't funded. I know a lot of people in this room will have received the funding from the government, but we absolutely believe that the family hub model is something that we want to implement, and it is something that is the right way to go to build on the success of Sure Start and create an all-family offer. What I wanted to ask was, for those areas that did not receive funding, we're in Greater Manchester, so 7 authorities received funding, 1 authority received part, and 2 received none. How do we go about ensuring that there are not health disparities across borders for those that weren't funded? I'm very interested, obviously, in the ICB in terms of Coventry and Warwick. Warwickshire, where one is funded and one is not. How do we ensure that there are not them health disparities for those funded services across those borders?
That's a killer question, isn't it? Isn't it lunchtime? So in Coventry and Warwickshire, as you rightly said, Coventry has applied and secured the resources and is a trailblazer. Warwickshire, obviously, it does have issues and challenges and inequalities, and it has developed its own response, which is it's very similar to the Family Hub, but it just hasn't attracted that level of resource that Coventry's secured. So all of these resources, no matter what the initiative is, and in this case it's the development of that Family Hub model, they're only seed cord funding to get you started for what is the right way of working anyway. So, it's cold comfort, but actually this is the right thing to do, and we need to use mainstream resources to achieve it. And so that's what's happening in Warwickshire. But eventually that will be what's happening in Coventry. They won't have, this additional programme funding forever, but they will have the responsibility to share their model, share their learning, and help other local authorities to get there faster and not have to go through the whole cycle of learning that Coventry and other trailblazers have had. So that's essentially the way forward. There's no way that you can duplicate that level of resource, and of course the local authorities are not going to be able to hand over cash that they've been given for one particular area to deliver in another. But this is the way that we have to work. This is everything that we've talked about today has made it really clear that this is a model that is how we do need to do things, and all of the agencies that have got resources around these objectives will have to contribute and align their resources accordingly, and that's something that I was alluding to in my talk. I mean, I really think that we all need to be resourcing this and not simply relying on trailblazer funding.
What do you think?
So I was just going to say, sorry, I think it's about building those relationships as well. So Hampshire and the Isle of Wight ICB is exactly the same. 3 small local authority areas have got the money, and the large county, the Shire County, doesn't have that funding. What we've already agreed to do is to develop an ICB approach to our first 1001 days. Our 4 directors of public health from each of the local authority areas are regularly meeting together in a new board to pull an idea of what that set of principles will look like, what our baseline expectation for all 4 local authority areas will be. We've started to map what the differences are in our service offers so that we can be really clear that we're pushing out unwanted variation in those 4 places, but acknowledging where variation needs to remain. The 4 local areas all work very differently, but there is a base level of expectation that we should have for our families. The level of integration across the 4 areas is very different. Integration brings with it some efficiency benefits, so actually moving your integration on at pace will also kind of aid some of that. So there's lots of things to look at before you look at the funding and the investment. We've done a lot of that integration work in Portsmouth before our investment came along, so this gives us an opportunity to take that next step. But really mapping where you're at, what your current spend does, how it does it, who it does it with, and particularly in an ICB, how that then maps across any of the local authority places will kind of be your key start point. You will at some point, I'm sure, need investment, but once all of those things are in place, it gives you a really sound position to make those investment asks, both of the NHS and the local authority, and it will give you that sense of shared responsibility. At the moment, I think in a lot of places, this is seen very much as a local authority thing to kind of get and do, and that absolutely isn't the issue. So once you've done all that mapping and pathway kind of work, it will give you that sense of where you need to go next.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Westminster developed family hubs without any funding, and I think the most positive part of that was the investment in transformation and integration and that all partners now commit to shared priorities for the next 3 years, and that's together with the community. And I think that's through looking at data and looking at the need. So I think the integration and getting one practice model that people are working from is probably one of the most important parts. Do you want to add anything? No. Okay. Sorry, Rob. Yeah.
Just very quickly to say that a big part of the decision as to where family hubs were based was based on the local deprivation of the local authorities, which again is cold comfort, but there is an attempt there to do something about health inequalities. And in London, about half of our boroughs have family hubs and half of them do not. Actually, a lot of the most innovative stuff is happening in the boroughs that do not have family hubs at the moment, partly because they don't have to follow the rules and hit the milestones and do what they're told by the man in the ministry, maybe. In London, we're trying to think about how we have conversations across family hub areas and non-family hub areas. And so Jane set up a community of practice which has a lot of people from children's services background sharing good ideas and what they're doing, what's working, what's challenging. We're trying to develop that further and think about the health side of things and the healthcare side of things and getting other conversations in there. So for instance, infant feeding, perinatal mental health, some of those sort of things, and fathering. And it'll become important to understand what the outcomes of this are. So we were talking about shared outcomes frameworks. Actually, if local systems understand what their priorities are, then we can start to see whether the family hubs have an impact and whether areas in Greater Manchester are pulling ahead because they do have that model, and then that's an argument for funding, isn't it? So I think it's really important that we do not forget about the half of the country that do not have family hubs, and they have access to the same workforce development that family hub areas do, recognising that there's a resource difference. But there's stuff that we can do within local systems to keep family hubs integrated with non-family hub areas.
Thank you. I think we need to end there and let you all go and have your lunch. So thank you very much to all the panel for giving up their time.